The ominous atmosphere of Montana's desolate highways had always carried a reputation among travelers. The vast emptiness of the landscape, the eternal sway of tall grasses under harsh winds, and the oppressive silence that seemed to swallow even the faintest sound of life, these were the elements that built the state's legends. Some whispered about strange occurrences along isolated routes. Truckers and wanderers told stories of phantom hitchhikers, bizarre lights in the sky, and unexplainable horrors that emerged only under the veil of night. It was a place where the vastness of the wilderness could mask anything, crime, accidents, or worse. The man in this story was an experienced truck driver, a veteran of the road whose life had been shaped by countless hours behind the wheel. He had navigated every kind of terrain imaginable, snow-covered mountain passes, rain-soaked forest highways, blistering desert stretches, but nothing unnerved him quite like the isolation of the Great Plains. Still, he prided himself on his practicality and his ability to keep his wits about him, even in the face of adversity. Superstitions, he believed, were the domain of bored minds and restless imaginations. He'd heard all the tales, passed around like folklore between truck stops, ghostly figures hitching rides, phantom lights in the rearview mirror, strange creatures crossing roads in the dead of night. But he had never given them much thought. To him, the open road was a workplace, not a source of fear. And yet, that night was different. He couldn't put his finger on it, but a sense of unease had begun to grow from the moment he turned off the main highway. It was subtle at first, like a dull itch at the back of his mind, easily ignored as he focused on following the directions sent by his company. He chalked it up to irritation over the inconvenience. An emergency fuel stop in the middle of nowhere was the last thing he needed on an already long haul. But as the miles wore on, that irritation transformed into something colder, heavier. It settled in his chest, an unshakable weight that seemed to press against him with every passing minute. His detour had been unavoidable. The fuel miscalculation wasn't his fault, but that didn't make it any less frustrating. His company had promised reimbursement, but money wasn't the issue, time was. Long-haul truckers lived by the clock, every mile meticulously planned to ensure deliveries were made on schedule. A detour like this could throw everything off. And so, he found himself veering onto a narrow, desolate road that seemed to stretch endlessly into the darkness. It was the kind of road that didn't appear on most maps, a forgotten artery that threaded its way through the lifeless heart of the plains. The absence of moonlight made the journey all the more disorienting. Normally, the moon would cast a faint silver glow over the landscape, providing some sense of depth and dimension. But tonight, the sky was an unbroken sheet of black, as though the heavens themselves had been swallowed by the void. Even the stars, which should have been brilliant in such a remote area, seemed muted and distant, their faint glimmers barely piercing the oppressive darkness. It was as if the night itself had thickened, becoming a tangible force that pressed down on the land. His headlights cut through the blackness, their beams illuminating the cracked asphalt directly ahead and little else. Beyond the reach of the light, the world was a featureless void, a shadowy abyss that seemed to stretch forever. The truck's engine growled steadily beneath him, its rhythmic hum a small comfort against the otherwise overwhelming silence. But even that comfort felt fragile, as though the silence were waiting for an opportunity to swallow it whole. This wasn't his first time driving through Montana's backroads, but there was something distinctly unsettling about this particular stretch. The emptiness felt sharper, more hostile, as though the land itself were warning him to turn back. He tried to shake the thought. Isolation did strange things to the mind, especially on these lonely routes. It was easy to let your thoughts wander, to imagine shapes in the shadows or hear phantom noises in the wind. He reminded himself that he was a professional, a man of logic and reason. There was nothing out here but open land and his own overactive imagination. But logic didn't explain the chill that had crept into the cab of his truck. The heater was running, yet the air felt cold and damp, carrying a faint metallic tang that he couldn't quite place. He glanced at the thermometer on his dashboard, but the temperature outside hadn't dropped enough to account for the change. It was a small thing, barely worth noting, but it gnawed at him nonetheless. He tightened his grip on the steering wheel, his knuckles whitening under the pressure, and told himself to focus. Just a few more miles to the gas station, and he'd be back on track. Still, the sense of unease continued to grow. The road seemed narrower than it should have been, the edges of the asphalt crumbling into loose gravel that threatened to pull his tires off course. The terrain on either side was impossible to discern, swallowed by the inky darkness beyond his headlights. It was like driving through a tunnel with no walls, the horizon erased by the suffocating blackness. Even the occasional road signs, rusted and barely legible, seemed alien, their faded letters warning of places he'd never heard of, places that didn't feel real. His thoughts began to spiral, the oppressive silence feeding his anxiety. He tried to distract himself by focusing on the details of the drive, the speedometer needle holding steady, the faint vibration of the road beneath his tires, the way the beams of his headlights flickered slightly when they passed over a crack or pothole. But the distractions were fleeting. His mind kept returning to the feeling that he wasn't alone, that something unseen was watching from the darkness just beyond the reach of his lights. It was irrational, he knew that, but the feeling persisted, gnawing at the edges of his composure. He checked his mirrors out of habit, half expecting to see another vehicle behind him, but the view was the same as it had been for the past hour, empty road stretching into oblivion. No headlights, no taillights, not even the faint glow of distant towns on the horizon. He was utterly, terrifyingly alone. And yet, he couldn't shake the sense that he wasn't. It was a contradiction that defied explanation, an unspoken tension that hung in the air like a storm waiting to break. The truck rumbled on, its engine the only sound in a world that felt otherwise lifeless. He tried to convince himself that this was just another night on the road, another story to tell when he reached the next truck stop. But deep down, he knew this night was different. The land, the sky, the silence, everything about it felt wrong, as though the universe itself had shifted ever so slightly out of alignment. And as he drove deeper into the void, he couldn't help but wonder if he was driving towards something he wasn't meant to find. As he drove, the realization that he hadn't passed another vehicle in over an hour began to press on him like a growing weight. Long stretches of solitude weren't unusual for him, he'd spent years navigating the most remote parts of the country, finding a kind of peace in the steady rhythm of his truck and the emptiness of the road. But tonight, the solitude felt different. It wasn't the peaceful stillness he'd come to appreciate. This was heavy, suffocating, and filled with an almost tangible sense of absence of life, of connection, of safety. It gnawed at the edges of his mind, a discomfort he couldn't shake no matter how much he tried to rationalize it. The rhythmic growl of his engine, usually a source of comfort, seemed quieter than it should have been, as though the night were swallowing the sound before it could reach his ears. The hum wasn't just muffled, it felt diminished, like it was struggling against the oppressive silence that surrounded him. It was a silence unlike any he'd experienced before, an unnatural stillness that seemed to seep into the cab of his truck, wrapping around him like a physical presence. It wasn't just quiet, it was the kind of silence that carried weight, the kind that made you hyper-aware of every creak, every rustle, every shift in the air. It felt alive, as though the night itself was listening, watching, waiting. His eyes flicked to his rearview mirrors out of habit, but the view was always the same, pitch-black darkness stretching endlessly behind him, the pale glow of his taillights swallowed by the void. It was disorienting, almost hypnotic, and he had to remind himself to keep his eyes on the road ahead. The darkness felt different here, thicker somehow, as if it wasn't just the absence of light but a presence in its own right, pressing in on him from all sides. Even the stars, usually brilliant in the wide-open skies of Montana, seemed dull and far away, their faint glimmers offering no comfort. They looked like they didn't belong to this sky, as though they were intruders peering into a place they shouldn't be. He found himself gripping the steering wheel tighter, his knuckles widening as a tension he couldn't explain built within him. It wasn't fear, not yet, but it was close. An unease that started in the pit of his stomach and slowly crept up his spine. His rational mind fought against it, reminding him that this was just another drive on another lonely road. But his instincts, honed by years of experience, whispered that something was wrong. He couldn't place it, couldn't name it, but the feeling was there, gnawing at him like an itch he couldn't scratch. Then, his headlights caught something in the distance. At first, it was just a vague shape, a dark smear against the pale gray of the asphalt. He squinted, leaning forward slightly as his hands instinctively eased the truck's speed. The shape grew clearer as he approached, resolving into a figure sprawled across the middle of the road. It wasn't moving, and as the light swept over it, a strange sense of dread settled over him, heavier than anything he'd felt before. It wasn't uncommon to see roadkill on these stretches of highway. Deer, raccoons, coyotes, they were an unfortunate but familiar sight. But even from a distance, he could tell this was different. There was something wrong about the shape, something unnatural in the way it lay sprawled across the road. His rational mind tried to reassure him, whispering that it was just an animal, that it wasn't anything to be concerned about. But his gut twisted, rejecting the explanation before it could take hold. The truck slowed to a crawl as the headlights fully illuminated the figure. His breath hitched, his hands tightening on the wheel as his eyes locked onto the scene before him. The first thing he noticed was the ribcage, gleaming, exposed, and horrifyingly intact. It rose out of the mangled mess like a grotesque centerpiece, its curved bones starkly white against the slick, glistening sinew that surrounded it. The body, or whatever it had been, was utterly devoid of flesh, its skin stripped away with a precision that was both surgical and inhuman. There were no jagged tears, no ragged edges to suggest the work of scavengers or a violent accident. The tissue was smooth, clean, as though it had been deliberately peeled away, leaving only the raw, red musculature beneath. His eyes scanned the rest of the figure, taking in details he wished he could unsee. There was no head. No fur, no feathers, no clothing, nothing to indicate what this thing had once been. Just a twisted pile of bones and sinew, steam rising faintly from the exposed tissue as if the body were still warm. The ribcage, human-like in shape and size, seemed to mock him, its presence an affront to everything he thought he understood about the world. His mind scrambled to make sense of it, grasping for explanations that could fit the scene before him. Maybe it was a deer, struck by a larger truck at high speed. That would explain the missing head, the mangled state of the body. But as quickly as the thought surfaced, he dismissed it. He'd seen deer carcasses before. They were messy, chaotic, their fur and flesh torn apart in ways that left no doubt about what had happened. This wasn't messy. It wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, calculated, wrong in a way that made his skin crawl. The truck idled in the middle of the road, its headlights casting long shadows across the figure. The world around him seemed to shrink, the darkness pressing closer as he stared at the thing lying before him. It felt like the road itself had disappeared, like he was floating in an endless void with nothing but the grotesque figure to anchor him. His heart pounded in his chest, the sound deafening in the silence, and for a moment, he felt paralyzed, unable to tear his eyes away. He didn't want to get closer, didn't want to confirm what his mind was already telling him. But he knew he couldn't just leave it there, couldn't drive away without knowing for sure. Something about the scene demanded acknowledgement, as if the very act of seeing it had drawn him into something he couldn't escape. The figure seemed to call to him, its presence a black hole that pulled at his curiosity and his fear in equal measure. The air in the cab felt heavy, suffocating, and he realized he'd been holding his breath. He exhaled shakily, his hands trembling as they gripped the wheel. He was no stranger to strange sights on the road, but this was different. This wasn't roadkill. This wasn't normal. And whatever it was, he couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't supposed to be here. For a long moment, he sat motionless, the low rumble of the idling engine filling the cab with an almost oppressive vibration. His breathing was shallow, his pulse hammering so hard that it felt like it might burst from his temples. He stared out into the darkness ahead, unable to shake the vivid image of the ribcage, glistening and pale under the harsh glare of his headlights. The unnaturalness of it gnawed at the edges of his sanity, an invasive thought that refused to be rationalized away. Could it really have been a human body? The question burned in his mind, its implications too horrifying to fully grasp. If it was, then what had happened to it? And why was it here, in the middle of an empty highway with no other vehicles or signs of life? His logical mind fought for control, latching onto the possibility that it was just an animal, a deer, perhaps, mutilated by another vehicle. But the details didn't add up. He had seen roadkill countless times, from freshly struck coyotes to decomposing carcasses that had been picked clean by scavengers. None of it compared to this. There had been no fur, no identifiable features, no sense of the chaotic violence that typically accompanied an animal struck at high speed. It had been stripped bare, as though the flesh had been peeled away with precision, leaving behind only raw meat and exposed bones. And that ribcage, it haunted him, its size and shape so disturbingly human that it made his stomach churn. The longer he sat there, the heavier the air in the cab became. His breath fogged the windshield, his unease mingling with the frost forming along the edges of the glass. He knew he should leave. His instinct screamed at him to put the truck in gear and drive, to abandon whatever grim scene lay behind him and never look back. But he couldn't. There was a pull, something deeper than curiosity, something primal and unshakable. It wasn't just the sense of responsibility, the thought that he might need to report what he'd seen. It was a compulsion, a gnawing need to confront the impossible and confirm what his mind refused to accept. Finally, with a deep, shaky breath, he made his decision. He reached for his flashlight, its cold metal casing a stark reminder of how little protection it offered against the unknown. When he opened the door, the frigid air hit him like a wall, sharp and biting, stealing his breath for a moment. The hum of the truck's engine seemed louder now, reverberating into the emptiness, a solitary sound in a world otherwise consumed by silence. He stepped down onto the pavement, the crunch of gravel under his boots sounding unnaturally loud in the stillness. When he stepped out into the frigid night air, the silence struck him like a physical force. The darkness pressed in from all sides, broken only by the faint red glow of his truck's brake lights. As he walked toward the corpse, flashlight in hand, the beam cut through the night, revealing patches of frost on the cracked asphalt and wisps of steam rising from the remains. The closer he got, the more vivid the details became, and his initial fear crystallized into raw horror. This wasn't normal roadkill. It wasn't something that belonged on any highway, in any place. The ribcage gleamed under the beam of his light, as if it had been freshly stripped. The meat clinging to the bones glistened wetly, untouched by the decay that typically claimed dead animals on the road. And the absence of a head lent the entire scene an unnatural quality, as though the body had been deliberately mutilated. He stood there, unable to move, as the cold seemed to seep into his bones. The weight of the moment bore down on him, heavier than the night, pressing on his chest until his breaths came shallow and strained. The world around him had become oppressive, the silence no longer still but vibrating with an unbearable tension, as though the land itself was holding its breath, waiting. Every sound became amplified in the crushing quiet. The wind whispered low across the fields, an eerie, mournful sigh that made the surrounding darkness feel alive, its unseen presence brushing against him in a way that made his skin crawl. The truck, just 50 feet behind him, creaked faintly as its frame settled, the soft metallic groans cutting through the silence like tiny, distant warnings. Even the pounding of his own heartbeat seemed unnaturally loud, reverberating in his ears with a frantic, primal rhythm that made it impossible to think clearly. And then, the smell hit him. It crept up on him slowly at first, an almost imperceptible shift in the air that grew stronger with every breath. The acrid tang of iron was unmistakable, sharp and metallic, but beneath it was something far worse, something sickly sweet, cloying, and rotten. It was the smell of decay, the kind of stench that lingered in places untouched by life, where death hung heavy and tangible. It filled his nostrils and clawed its way down his throat, turning his stomach and sending a wave of nausea crashing over him. He gagged, his free hand instinctively rising to cover his mouth and nose, but the scent clung to the air, inescapable and relentless. The sickening odor was a stark reminder of the reality before him, dragging his mind back to the grotesque scene illuminated by his flashlight. He fought to make sense of it, to impose some kind of logic on the twisted image burned into his eyes. But the more he tried, the more his thoughts unraveled, slipping away like sand through his fingers. The ribcage, the raw sinew, the clean, deliberate mutilation, it didn't fit. It didn't belong here. It didn't belong anywhere. And yet, here it was, a macabre tableau that defied explanation. The idea of calling the police flickered in his mind like a weak, sputtering flame, offering a fleeting sense of hope before it was extinguished by the cold reality of his isolation. He fumbled for his phone, his fingers trembling as he pulled it from his jacket pocket. The faint glow of the screen seemed almost mocking against the oppressive darkness, a fragile barrier between him and the vast emptiness surrounding him. He stared at the display, willing it to show even the faintest promise of connection, but the signal bar remained stubbornly empty. One moment, a single, faint bar flickered to life, giving him a brief surge of hope, only to vanish a heartbeat later, leaving him cut off and alone. He was 50 miles from the nearest town, 50 miles from any semblance of help or safety. The sheer isolation of his predicament struck him like a blow, the realization that there was no one to turn to, no one to share the burden of what he was facing. Panic began to creep in at the edges of his mind, its insidious tendrils winding tighter around his thoughts with every passing second. He lowered the phone, his hand trembling as he tried to steady his breathing, to hold on to some fragment of control. And then, he saw them. At first, he thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection caused by his flashlight beam. But as he swung the light to the shoulder of the highway, the silhouettes became clear. Coyotes, a small pack of them, had gathered behind the rusted fence that separated the road from the fields. They stood motionless, watching him. Their yellow eyes seemed unnaturally bright, almost intelligent, as they reflected the light. It was their stillness that unsettled him most. Coyotes were usually skittish creatures, quick to scatter at the sight of humans. But these didn't move. They simply stared, their bodies tense and waiting, as though they were assessing him. When the first coyote stepped through the broken section of the fence, its movements were deliberate, unhurried. Others followed, slipping through the gap and padding silently toward the road. Their eyes never left him, their approach slow and methodical. A primal instinct surged through him, overriding his curiosity and forcing him to retreat. He hurried back to his truck, his heart pounding so loudly that he could hear it in his ears. By the time he reached the cab and slammed the door shut, the coyotes were already at the edge of the road, their gazes fixed on him. The truck roared to life as he hit the accelerator, the tires screeching against the pavement as he sped away. In his mirrors, the figures grew smaller but didn't disappear. The pack lingered at the roadside, watching him retreat into the night. Even when they were out of sight, their glowing eyes haunted his mind. As he continued down the desolate road, the darkness seemed to close in around him, more oppressive with every passing mile. His mind churned, caught in an endless loop of analysis and denial, replaying the grotesque scene over and over, each detail more vivid and unsettling than the last. He wanted to believe the explanation he had clung to, that it had been a deer, its body mangled by some high-speed collision. But the details wouldn't align, no matter how hard he tried to make them fit. He had seen roadkill 1,000 times before, and nothing in his experience came close to resembling what lay on that stretch of highway. The absence of fur or hide haunted him. A deer struck by a truck might be broken, torn, and bloodied, but its fur would still cling stubbornly to its flesh. The evisceration was another problem. It wasn't chaotic or violent, as though the impact had ripped the body apart. It was disturbingly methodical, with an unnatural precision that gnawed at the edges of his rationality. And the ribcage, the haunting image of those clean, white bones, exposed and gleaming like an anatomical display, refused to leave his mind. No scavenger he could think of worked that way. No natural force could explain it. He knew it, even as he tried to deny it. The possibility that it had been human pushed its way back into his thoughts, insistent and unrelenting. He fought against it, forcing himself to think of anything else. A human body, stripped of flesh, headless and left in the middle of the road, it was unthinkable. And yet, the shape, the proportions, the sheer wrongness of it all pointed to something he didn't want to admit. His stomach churned, and his hands tightened on the wheel as though clinging to it could somehow ground him in reality, could keep him from slipping further into the spiraling fear that threatened to consume him. The darkness outside seemed alive now, pressing against the windows like an entity all its own. It had weight, density, as though the void were an ocean and he was driving through its depths. The headlights cut through it in thin, pale beams, illuminating only the road directly ahead. Beyond their reach, the world felt infinite and unknowable, a vast emptiness that could swallow anything, including him. He glanced in his mirrors more often than he cared to admit, half expecting to see something staring back at him. A part of him knew how irrational it was, but the sense of being watched lingered, a cold, prickling sensation that crawled up his spine and settled between his shoulder blades. His imagination ran wild, conjuring images of glowing eyes emerging from the blackness, the pack of coyotes still trailing him, their silent forms flitting in and out of the shadows just beyond his field of vision. He tried to shake the thought, to remind himself that they were animals, bound by instinct, likely scavenging for food near the body. But the memory of their behavior refused to fade. They hadn't acted like normal coyotes. There had been no hesitation, no fear, no barking or growling. Their silence had been deliberate, almost intelligent, and their eyes, those cold, unblinking eyes, had seemed to see through him, to something deeper, something vulnerable. The night seemed to stretch on forever, the blackness swallowing the world around him. He never did see another vehicle, nor any sign of life beyond the pale glow of his headlights. When he finally reached the gas station hours later, the lights of the small, run-down building seemed almost blinding in their intensity. Yet even as he filled his tank and prepared to rejoin the main highway, the memory of the ribcage, the coyotes, and the overwhelming silence of the night refused to fade. The trucker would never know for certain what he had encountered on that desolate stretch of road, and it was this lack of closure that would torment him the most. The scene replayed in his mind endlessly, unbidden, each recollection as vivid and harrowing as the moment it first unfolded before him. The headless, skinless body was more than just a memory, it was a dark fragment lodged deep in his psyche, resurfacing in flashes during the quiet moments of his life. It would creep in during the dead of night when he sat alone in his truck cab, the hum of the engine no longer a comfort but a hollow echo in a world that now felt far less stable than it once had. The haunting image of those coyotes lingered as well, their unnatural stillness and unblinking gaze a riddle that defied all reason. In his mind, they became more than animals, they were symbols, emissaries of whatever dark force had laid claim to that lonely stretch of road. He couldn't shake the feeling that they had been watching him not out of curiosity, but with purpose, as though they had been witnesses to something he was never meant to see. And worse, he couldn't escape the unnerving suspicion that they had followed him, not physically but in some other way, their presence lingering like a shadow on the edges of his consciousness. He tried to convince himself that it was all just an unfortunate encounter, a bizarre accident of nature or circumstance that he had stumbled upon by sheer mischance. He told himself it had been nothing more than a deer, mangled by another vehicle and left to rot, the coyotes simply opportunistic scavengers drawn by the scent of fresh meat. But these reassurances rang hollow, his mind always circling back to the same stark truths, the absence of fur, the precision of the evisceration, the haunting gleam of the ribcage under his flashlight. These were not the hallmarks of a natural event. They were deliberate. Methodical. Wrong. Over time, the trucker began to notice other changes in himself. The world, once a predictable and stable place, now seemed veined with uncertainty and shadows. He found himself hyper-aware of his surroundings in ways that unsettled him, his ears tuned to the faintest of sounds, his eyes scanning every roadside with a vigilance he couldn't suppress. His night drives, once a peaceful part of his routine, now felt fraught with unseen dangers. The stretches of empty highway that had once provided solace now seemed alive with unseen possibilities, the darkness no longer a mere absence of light but a presence in itself, watching, waiting, hiding truths he could neither see nor understand. The encounter had left him with a gnawing sense of vulnerability, a realization that the world was larger, darker, and stranger than he had ever imagined. He began to notice patterns where there shouldn't have been any, his mind connecting dots that he didn't want to acknowledge. Other truckers would speak in hushed tones of strange occurrences on lonely highways, of headlights that followed but never passed, of figures seen walking at the roadside only to vanish into thin air, of unexplained noises that echoed across empty landscapes. Where once he would have dismissed such tales as mere superstition or exaggeration, he now listened with a quiet, uneasy understanding. He never shared his own experience, but he knew, deep down, that what he had seen was part of something larger. Something ancient. Something wrong. In his more introspective moments, he wondered why it had been him, why he had been the one to stumble upon the scene that night. Was it chance? Or had the road chosen him, pulling him off the beaten path and into its depths for reasons he could never comprehend? He thought often of the detour, the fuel miscalculation that had forced him down that cursed stretch of highway. It was a small thing, a clerical error, yet it had changed everything. He couldn't help but feel that it hadn't been a mistake at all, that the road had been waiting for him, its darkness stretching out like a spider's web, drawing him in. The worst part of it all was the sense that it wasn't over. The feeling of finality that he so desperately craved never came. There was no resolution, no clarity, no end to the gnawing uncertainty that followed him wherever he went. He would catch himself glancing in his mirrors, half expecting to see the glowing eyes of the coyotes staring back at him, their silent forms trailing him through the night. He avoided certain routes, certain stretches of road that reminded him too much of that night, but the fear followed him anyway, lurking in the corners of his mind. It was a weight he carried with him, invisible but ever present, a constant reminder that some things in this world defy understanding. And though he would never speak of it, not to his fellow truckers, not to friends or family, there was one thought that he could never fully banish: whatever had been on that road, whatever had left that mutilated body and drawn the coyotes to its remains, was still out there. It hadn't ended that night. It hadn't disappeared when he drove away. It was waiting, somewhere in the vast, empty expanse of the world, biding its time. Whether it was bound to that stretch of highway or free to roam, he didn't know. But he couldn't shake the feeling that it hadn't been the last time the road would reveal its terrible secret to an unsuspecting traveler. Perhaps, someday, someone else would find themselves in his position, staring into the darkness and finding it staring back.